Hello, everyone. Welcome to Presenting Alfred Hitchcock. This is episode 1, The Pleasure Garden. I'm one of your hosts, Kenny. With me, as always, is Sam and Lance. This week officially kicks off the Hitchcock Challenge, where we will be watching every single movie Alfred Hitchcock directed in chronological order, and then meeting right back here after each movie to discuss them in ridiculously long videos. Each video will also contain a spoiler-free synopsis from either Sam or Lance, just in case you're on the fence about watching the movie. Lance, Pleasure Garden, go.
Okay. The Pleasure Garden follows the adventures of two young women as their lives become intertwined in a London theater and then diverge, taking them on two very different journeys. The story centers on Patsy and Jill, two chorus girls who dance at the eponymous Pleasure Garden Theater. We begin with Jill, newly arrived in London from the country, entering the Pleasure Garden to seek a job as a dancer. She tries to deliver a letter of introduction to the theater manager, the cigar-smoking Mr. Hamilton, only to discover that the letter and all of her money have been pilfered by two shady-looking guys standing outside the theater. As Jill fends off the advances of two other men in the theater, she's befriended by Patsy, a dancer who offers to take her in and let her stay with her. At Patsy's home, we're introduced to her parents, and more importantly, Cuddles, her rowdy puppy. As the two women get ready for bed, Jill shows Patsy a picture of her fiancé, Hugh, who we learn is about to begin a 2-year stint overseas with the company at a place known only as the Plantation. The next day, Patsy takes Jill back to the Pleasure Garden, where Jill convinces a skeptical Mr. Hamilton to give her an audition. Jill kills it and is offered a job on the spot, beginning her rise to fame. Soon, Jill's fiancé Hugh shows up in London for a visit before departing to the plantation along with his boss, Mr. Levitt. And so begin the romantic entanglements involving Jill, Patsy, Hugh, Mr. Levitt, and of course, Prince Ivan, a fan of Jill, who begins courting her as her star rises. The Pleasure Garden is ultimately a romantic adventure set in different exotic locations involving the classic themes of love, friendship, betrayal, and even murder.
All right. One small correction though. Wasn't Prince Ivan going after Jill, not Patsy?
I put a fan of Patsy's. We can do an edit, and I can just
do a wild of just that line, and we can splice it in.
Yep. And you can
say Jill like 5 different ways, and then you can use the one that's most appropriate.
Jill.
Okay, good, but natural, more natural. Cut that out.
All right. So before we get started, we usually tell everyone how to watch these movies, and the Pleasure Garden is, unfortunately, to start with, not available anywhere in the United States. If you simply must own a digital version of this and have a multi-region DVD player, Brenton Film recommends this version from Network UK. So the version I watched started with a screen that said a Rohauer film collection release. So I looked him up, and there's some drama related to how we should think of the bootleg films that we're watching. So some quick backstory on this guy. He ran a theater in California named the Coronet in the early 50s. It was run as a private film club because at the time it was illegal to show films containing nudity in the United States. And I mean any nudity at all. We're not just talking about pornos. Because he was considered a non-commercial theater, he became known for showing exploitation films, rare European films, but mostly he was known for being one of the only theaters in the 1950s that was playing the early silent films. He had this great racket where, for the most part, he would borrow the silent films from the Museum of Modern Art, and for reasons that I did not look into, a lot of these silent films were in the public domain back then. So Rohauer realized that if he cut the films up, switched out the titles and cards, and in some cases making edits just based on his personal likes and dislikes, he could then claim ownership of the movie and ban anyone else from showing it. A lot of times the movies would have the MoMA like watermark on them, the ones he would actually show and claim that he owned. But getting back to the Pleasure Garden, almost every available bootleg that any of us have watched is likely made from a Rohauer cut, meaning the title screens are all suspect and should not be considered as having anything to do with Alfred Hitchcock. which is unfortunate because Alfred Hitchcock started out as a designer of these type of cards. So it would have been interesting to see them.
All right, Alfred Hitchcock was a really cool guy. He his parents were really strange people. There was this anecdote he used to tell when he was, after he became famous, that his mom once reported him to the police and had him. What did he do again? You guys help me out on that. Did he like stole something from his?
I don't think they said how. I think his dad had just given him a note and sent him, according to his story, he was like 5 and just sent him to the police. And then he didn't read the note, and the note.
He was a naughty. He did something bad, and
Yeah.
his dad. It was his dad, not his mom. Pardon me. So his dad sent him to the police station with a note that said, "Lock me up for the night." And he credited that. It's one of those like 2 perfect stories as part of the Hitchcock mythology, and there were a lot of those. But it was great, and he credited that for his lifelong suspicion of authority figures. He had the classic sort of like sympathetic mother, distant and kind of domineering father, which if you want to get Freudian about, I'm sure there's a lot we could get into with that. But anyway, Alfred Hitchcock was a director, as I've learned. He also was an engineering student. A lot of people in his station in life would have had a sort of a tendency to go into a more practical field. So the telegraph was a new invention at this time. He studied it, and because of his sort of his proclivities, his talents in art, he sort of moved over to the commercial side of that business and started working in their advertising. And then through a series of scrapes and dodges, he managed to find his way into film production, where he was first an art director and a title card designer, and managed to do that while kind of absorbing everything he could about international cinema, because British films at that time were not as sophisticated as German or American films, primarily in lighting. And I think he learned a lot in this formative period of how to separate subject from background with lighting techniques, which were kind of new in Hollywood. And Fritz Lang, which we've had the disclaimer, none of us know that much about movies, but just as a layperson watching Fritz Lang movies, how striking the lighting in is and how dramatic the contrasts are, you could tell that was something that Hitchcock picked up on. So these early movies where he was director, critics at the time, I've read, were also really impressed. He was considered to be like the man with the mastermind, was a early sort of epithet. Is that the right word? That was attached to him, or he was tagged with. And I think that probably maybe put him on the course to this like self-mythologizing that he later became a master of, where he kind of created, it was almost like a brand, the Hitchcock film. He was credited in every film on the poster. Before the title of the film, you would know it was a Hitchcock movie.
Yeah, you can definitely see the stamp of, he begins in this first movie, you see a few of those Hitchcock traits, manifest, but it definitely feels like a product of a studio. It feels like a crowd pleasing kind of movie, for that era. It doesn't necessarily feel like a Hitchcock film.
Yeah, a lot of these films, the truth is, a lot of these films are adaptations of popular books at the time.
So that The Pleasure Garden is based on a book by Oliver Sandys, and this is stolen from Wikipedia. Oliver Sandys was a pseudonym for Marguerite Florence Laura Jarvis, a British writer, screenwriter, and actress. She was a best-selling author of her era. She wrote 38 novels as Oliver Sandys, including 6 films, and 21 she wrote as Countess Barsinska. 5 of those were films. The Pleasure Garden, the novel, is long out of print and very difficult to find in hard copy on Amazon or eBay, if you can find it at all. Your best option, if you really want to read this, is to find it online at the Internet Archive, which has a bunch of free public domain books that you can read there. I wanted to talk about the soundtrack with you guys now, because I think all of the soundtracks for this movie were done by a guy named Lee Irwin in 1981, who was hired by Raymond Rohauer. And I didn't find any other ones besides his and the videos I looked at, but so it might be the only one. There could be other ones. You can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But just a quick thing on Lee Irwin. He was a theater organist and composer that was a stickler for history and scored over 70 silent films. But one interesting thing that I did find out about him just yesterday on IMDb is that when Lee Irwin was in high school in the 1920s, he actually substituted for a regular organist at 2 silent era theaters. So this guy was as authentic a composer as you can really get, because he actually played while these movies played, which is kind of cool. In talking about the technical, the only other couple of things I wanted to kind of touch on here was just some of the names in the credits. I like to look at them and kind of look them up and just see if there's anything interesting to look at, or people that work with Hitchcock more than once are kind of interesting. Elliot Stannard is listed as the screenwriter here. So
Did we ever figure out if that's Stannard or Stannard?
I don't know. Besides being not experts, I am not good at pronouncing names. So it could, I keep saying Rohauer too. I don't know if that's the right way.
I knew someone with the last name Stannard, and they said Stannard.
Or I'm going to call him Elliot Stannard from now on then. But he is the screenwriter. He was the screenwriter for 8 of Hitchcock's 10 silent films. And he wrote 88 screenplays in a 15-year period. So this guy's like a major workhorse. But I don't know what a silent film script would look like, because you don't have dialogue. So he's just taking the movie and maybe making scenes out of it. Or it'd be interesting to take a look at what the actual script is.
Well, so that brings up an interesting point too, because you do see a lot of lip reading. I have to do a lot of lip reading in these films, and it does look like they are frequently speaking dialogue, in addition to gestures and emoting. So even though the dialogue doesn't necessarily appear on the title cards, there is dialogue. They are talking. I don't know if they're ad-libbing or not. I don't know, but there's definitely dialogue that just doesn't get passed into the, and you're sort of somehow the audience is able to sort of get the message of what's being communicated.
The other name on this list that we should probably talk about a little bit is Alma Reville, who is credited as the assistant director on The Pleasure Garden. She's also, you can probably consider a collaborator on every single Alfred Hitchcock movie, in that she marries him soon after this movie. I think they started dating during The Pleasure Garden. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. They had a pretty swift courtship too. They married by the time they were doing was it Downhill?
Were they married in Mountain Eagle? Was that?
Oh, Mountain Eagle. That was the one. Yeah, that was the one.
All right, so this is where they started the romance. Alma Reville, all I know is I think she was more established at the studio than Hitchcock was when he came in and became director. I think she was doing a lot more. And then, he got the directing gig and a romance started there.
Yeah, from what I've read, it sounds like she played a huge part in a lot of his movies from the beginning, that they would plan out a lot of the visuals together, which was part of what makes his early movies so good is how visual they are, and working with the limitations of the silent film. You could see like that was a skill they really felt like, or a technique that they leaned on a lot for a lot of the storytelling. So they would work together and plan out shots together. And she was very involved in the early days as not just like scriptwriter or someone to consult on scripts, but as an editor. She had a lot to say as well. Art director and just visual accomplice.
All right, my last note on just technical is just talking about the cast a little bit. The film was made in Germany at Amelka Studios. and starred two up-and-coming American film actresses. Virginia Valley was cast as Patsy, and Carmelita Garrity as Jill. And again, I apologize for pronunciations. Carmelita Garrity was a new actress at the time and apparently had been traveling through Europe with Virginia Valley, who somehow managed to get her the part of Jill, even though a popular German actress had already been cast, according to an essay I just read by Joseph Garn-Kars this morning before we filmed.
Wow, in a weird way that mirrors the action.
Yeah, she gets her friend this role in the movie, and then, yeah, their characters do the same thing within the movie. Yeah, it's very strange. I had thought going in that these two were both super famous American actresses, and apparently they were both kind of on the rise. Virginia Valley a little bit more famous.
Wow.
The two male leads were British actors who had a relationship with Hitchcock before The Pleasure Garden. Miles Mander, in particular, who plays Levitt, had worked on a movie called The Prude's Fall, which was directed by Graham Cutts. Alfred Hitchcock is credited as the co-writer, art director, and assistant director of that movie. And Miles Mander played a role in it as an actor. So they would have known each other from that. And that was only a year before The Pleasure Garden.
In the book that I think we talked about, there were some kind of amusing anecdotes. One is that Hitchcock, well, first off, he got robbed of a large sum of money that was supposed to be paying for his room and other incidentals, because he was flashing his cash in Italy, and he got robbed, and so he had to borrow money from the lead in order to stay at the hotel. They tried to hide, so they didn't have to pay customs on the film. The studio wanted them to hide the film from the somewhere, so it wouldn't have to go through customs, but it got discovered, and so all their film got confiscated. So when they got there, they had to basically get new film imported in because it was, had been confiscated, and so that caused a bit of a delay as well. So, oh, and another one, Hitchcock found out about menstruation during this period. Apparently, as a 25-year-old man, he did not know what it was, but the woman who we will discuss later, who was I guess the native on the plantation. Yeah, I guess she was menstruating and did not want to go into the water for that one scene, which we will get to, and so they were conferring with other women. And she went over to explain to Hitchcock she doesn't want to go in. She doesn't want to do the scene because she's menstruating. And Hitchcock didn't know what that was, and he had to have menstruation explained to him. So, different time.
Yeah, and I find that I feel like that story's suspect, but I am starting to wonder, because I read that similar story in
here.
No, that's
right here.
He tells Truffaut that story too. And I start to feel like maybe it's one of those stories he tells, like the mythology of himself.
Could be.
Rather than what is the true. Opening shot, blondes running down a spiral staircase, two of Hitchcock's favorite subjects right out the gate.
Yeah, he was like, as a young man, he must have just been in ecstasy, filming that scene. And it is a beautiful scene.
Yeah, the behind the scene, the different perspectives you get on the stage. So the Pleasure Garden is the theater where the action of the story begins, and there's a nice montage at the beginning of just various perspectives, both from the audience point of view, from the point of view of the performers on stage, and the point of view of stagehands and people sort of behind the scenes, which, talking about the early film era, having a film turn the camera around on the audience, having a film capture angles and perspectives that, are unavailable to the audience. It's probably like a pretty interesting technical thing just to watch. It's also
that first tracking shot was impressive, where the camera is just moving to each of the I guess the front row people, and it's you see sort of one person to the cameras, just slowly moving from left to right, and you see the audience members, with various states of, ecstasy, mostly men.
Yeah,
Watching these four sort
leering
of
old men,
very old
puffing
men.
cigars,
Exactly.
watching beautiful young women perform.
And their bored wives, some of whom are sleeping.
So yeah, so we see Patsy, we see what a big star she is. That gets established. And there's a little bit of a question about who the star of this movie is, which will come up later. But Jill, who's the aspiring star, like in the early part of the movie, you kind of feel like this is all just set up so that you can see what Jill wants, which Jill is a young woman who's just moved to London. She left her fiance, Hugh, back at home. So Jill goes, she gets this letter of recommendation stolen from her outside the theater as she's going.
And her money and all her money.
And her money and every earthly possession that she's come with. And so she's kind of like, she's out of luck. And
she had a purse full of stuff, though. I was trying to figure out what that stuff was. It was like she'd put stuff, wrinkled stuff that looked like bills, but they weren't, apparently. I don't know. But,
or something, or
like, what is that crap that she's got in her? Like, she dumps it out, and the guy's like, "Nah, get out of here with your stuff." And so then she's just kind of stuck in the lobby, a young woman alone in London without any money or a letter of introduction, and without knowing anybody. So she's in a pretty desperate situation. And Patsy comes to her rescue. These two guys are leering at her, and they come over and start talking to her, and then Patsy kind of shoos them away and says, "Yeah, you can come stay with me, for the night." So Patsy rescues Jill, basically.
I think it's a great setup for Jill because we immediately give our sympathy to her, right? She's robbed, and then there are these two men. You feel like they're going to sexually assault her or something. The ones if Patsy doesn't come to the rescue. But after watching the movie and then thinking about it, you think if Patsy hadn't come, I think Jill would have been fine. She would have had those two men buying her dinner, putting her up in a hotel, and just based on her personality. And
we learn later, you're right. Actually, I hadn't even thought of it. As we learn later, Jill definitely knows how to handle herself.
When she leaves, she shoots the men a look, and I just couldn't help on the second viewing think of it. It's like a spider looking at two flies that just got away, just kind of like, "See you later, guy." I could have had you in the palm of my hand, but I'm going with Patsy instead. She's got to play a warm place.
One interesting question about this movie, and I'm pretty sure I know where you guys would fall, but it's the structure of it is a little odd because it's split almost down the middle, and we shift from Jill's point of view to Patsy's point of view, and it becomes Patsy's story by the end of the movie. And a question is, what was it, a mark of storytelling sophistication, or was it like a sort of directionless, a lot of these films sort of, or early cinema, the rules hadn't been written. So there are these sort of standalone scenes that are very dense and have a lot of action in them, but the bigger picture doesn't add up as much. So I think with Hitchcock, we can probably, guess that he knew exactly what he was doing, setting the story.
Well, he was only 25 years old, and it was early days in cinema, as you mentioned, and it's definitely storytelling. Obviously, that was certainly my impression based on this film was more primitive, and it could have been, and also, maybe there is some nuance that got chopped out of this version, or just in general when it was first released. There is a sort of slight dislocation that takes place in my head watching this movie, because Jill seems to be the subject of the film, and also the heroine. But then as it progresses, she becomes a kind of villain, and Patsy becomes the heroine.
I think subverting audience expectations is baked in with Hitchcock right from the beginning. You think he obviously his most successful attempt at it was Psycho, where it's one movie for half the movie, and then it's a completely different movie for the latter half of the movie. I'd read that that's what he wanted The Birds to be. He wanted the first half to be a slapstick comedy, and then the last half to be a horror movie, but he was talked out of it. And this movie The Pleasure Garden feels a little like the first half, or maybe the first 2/3 is like a rom-com, and then the last third is almost, it turns into a horror kind of suspense movie where it goes. And it does flip your expectations totally, because you enter a movie, usually you relate to the person who's new. So Jill's the new girl in town. She's showing up. So we kind of are the new people in this world. So we kind of relate to her instantly. So yeah, you expect her to be the main character.
You know, something that just kind of crossed my mind, and I haven't thought this one through, which will probably be clear once I start talking, but the structure of the story is Jill, the neophyte, comes to the um, pleasure garden where Patsy, the sort of practiced hand, the celebrity, who actually has a really good heart, ends up saving her, rescuing her, helping her, doing all that stuff. It's the opposite of what happens with the men in the story, which is that Hugh is the new guy in the plantation or the company that he's going out to work for in the colony somewhere, and help me out with the other guy,
Mr. Levitz.
Mr. Levitt.
Levitt, the established figure in that world, is the corrupt one. So you have Patsy, the sort of innocent established actress, and Levitt, the corrupted established businessman.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Hugh, yeah, it's just like a mirror of the dynamic that plays out between the two of them. Maybe that's something, maybe it's not, but I think it is kind of interesting because the two worlds that you're exploring of theater and of like colonial the exploitation and agriculture, it's like they're they couldn't be more far apart, you know.
There is a striking scene. I remember a striking scene. Well, when they get to her house, we meet her parents, and we meet Cuddles the dog, who plays actually an outsized role.
We haven't really settled it, or did we settle this? Patsy is either a lodger with that couple, or those are her parents.
Yeah, I was, you know what, I started after watching, after having gone through it a couple of times, my sense was that it was her. They never explicitly say it, but my sense is that it was her family. I mean, she invites them to her wedding, and they do give her the life savings. So they don't. I think when I first saw it, I kind of thought that she was lodging there, but I think it was her family.
See, I got to go. I'm going to go the opposite way from you on this one, Lance, and just say that I think based on just that her name is listed as Patsy Brand and they're listed as the Sides, that I initially had thought they were her parents too, but I've kind of switched to that she's a lodger because I looked up on Wikipedia boarding houses because I didn't know anything about them. And obviously we're coming up to a movie called The Lodger, so maybe a little background quick. In the 19th century, 1/2 to 1/3 of all urban dwellers rented a room to boarders or were boarders themselves. Boarders would share washing, breakfast, and dining facilities, and the proprietor would provide family-style breakfast and evening dinners in the common room. The housing boom of the 1950s all but ended boarding houses.
So they have a different last name then, because that would have been the
Right.
obvious tip-off. So yeah, it does sound like, so maybe I was right the first time I watched it, that they were, it's just, I guess they were just really close.
And I feel like they're trying to, and we're going to talk about this later, with the generosity of the poor comes into play where, they end up giving her some money. But right. I think that Hitchcock's playing on that a little bit, on wealth and on the different status that we're going to see from Mr. Hamilton's world versus the Sides world. So
Jill, when she gets there, when she meets Cuddles and she meets the family, the boarders or the proprietors, I guess we're all agreed on now. And then they're getting undressed, which is also kind of a racy scene. I mean, there's a lot of like young women undressing and, stockings being thrown around, which must have been pretty racy for the time. But she sits down and kneels next to the bed and prays, and Patsy is looking at her and Jill. And so you get this sense of Jill as this pious country girl who is kind of an innocent and naive waif in the big city, and then lights out. But of course the roles change pretty quickly.
That was Hitchcock showing a lot of sex appeal. I know it's a movie called The Pleasure Garden. Maybe most people are expecting that when they come in, but it's basically you're getting plot. So it's the movie is being moved along. but you have Patsy and Jill basically disrobing simultaneously, and they're both throwing their clothes. Like you're getting the cut to.
They're getting in bed together.
It's Patsy's bedroom, and she's throwing her clothes onto Jill's trunk, which has just been brought into the room, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, and then they're getting into bed together. And there's a number of shots of Jill where just from where the nudity would happen above, and leaning down on taking off her stockings or whatever it is. So I think Hitchcock knows what he's doing here, and they climb into bed together. And I'd read that someone asked him, was this, meant to suggest, lesbianism in the scene? And he coyly said something along the lines of him being sexually naive, which is why I also think the menstruation comment by him was probably, I think he plays that angle, but I think he knows what he's doing when he's shooting these scenes.
Maybe it's a combination of both. I mean, I think a lot of the myth about Hitchcock was like they were based on real things about him, but just blown up to sort of cinematic proportion.
Yeah.
So it's very possible he was sheltered. I mean, that I don't have a hard time believing that.
I don't either.
How sheltered or how much of that was a part of this is maybe up for debate. Definitely.
But that is an important scene of Jill praying at the bed, because this comes up again later, and Patsy giving her that smirk, like, oh, look at this quaint girl, like saying her prayers, and Cuddles ruins the scene by licking her
Cuddles
feet.
licks her feet.
Yes.
But Cuddles is a
Puppy.
moral compass in this film. He definitely is like someone who has a penetrating insight into the characters, the hearts of the characters.
Sam, I detect that you don't like that element.
What tipped you off?
Just a hunch.
It's it's a little bit ridiculous the way this dog is used to sort of tell you who's good and who's bad. It's the kind of stuff like you get in a Disney movie.
Here.
I said beat it.
You can't put that here.
There's also an interesting note on the bed scene. Right after Jill says her prayers, I noticed that she climbs into bed. And if you look at the bed, there's one oversized pillow and like a smaller one. And she pulls it over from Patsy and lays flat in the middle of it. And Patsy kind of looks at her and then just settles for a little edge of the pillow. So it's already an interesting sort of character set up for these two.
Yeah, that's a good thing to bring up, is like these movies are very dense, and 100 years has done a lot for cinema. And I think when you watch these early movies, there's just like a different approach to storytelling, and it comes across in all these different ways. And one of the ways is that in these very short scenes, very, very kind of visually interesting ways, little character development moments happen constantly.
And I didn't even see that. So that certainly would be a much bigger cue to what would happen with her later. I completely missed that. So yeah. Good catch, Kenny.
Thank you. I've also noticed, I wanted to comment on, we've talked about Hitchcock not liking to use a lot of title cards himself. Obviously, we don't know which title cards are his or if none of them are. But one trick he does use a lot throughout the film that I noticed is, which people like Wes Anderson do now, which they don't need to really because it's not a silent movie, but he'll take information that the characters have in the movie, like the note that says when it's time for the show. And then he'll show it to us. So we're reading a title card, but it's not a title card. It's information that the characters themselves would have. And he does it quite a few times in this movie. I just thought it was something to make note of. It's a way he gets around using a card maybe. But so now, we're up to Jill getting the job. And I wanted to ask you guys about this because I think she gets the job at the Pleasure Garden based on her confidence alone, because I don't think she danced well in her audition. I think she just had a ton of confidence. I actually looked up videos on the Charleston to see if what she was doing was the Charleston, and it doesn't look like any of the videos I've seen. Maybe you guys can correct me or someone in the comments, but
I am not a dance expert, but it didn't look like she was really, I wasn't necessarily blown away by her performance where I was saying, that is an astonishing level of skill in that Charleston. But I kind of just let that one kind of, like a lot of things, I think when I'm watching it, I'm kind of like, well, I get the idea here. The idea is that she's supposed to be knocking it out of the park. So, but yeah, it wasn't really like that. And then I'm also thinking, maybe pejoratively, maybe this is like we would kind of have this maybe contemptuous view sometimes of the past. And I was like, well, that's as well as they could dance back then. They couldn't dance any better. So I don't know. That's a very interesting question, Kenny. But I was not impressed with her dancing skills. So, but I just kind of like took it in stride. I'm also looking at a very crappy print. But yeah, she definitely was selling it with the confidence and chutzpah that she had. You know, she definitely. That's when you kind of see her really assertive personality. You know, maybe aggressive personality coming out.
Yeah, I mean, you have to really admire her character for whatever negatives like we might have to say about her later. Like, you know, she demands 4 times what he's offering her.
That's right.
And she makes him shake hands with her in front of everybody. The confidence that she brings to getting the thing that she wants, which in this case is fame and money, is it's really outstanding. It's something we could all take a note on, I think.
Yeah, she's a model in this film of upright behavior,
and she knows the sex appeal she carries, because right after she gets that job, there's a cut to her hugging Patsy, and then you see Mr. Hamilton leering at her with that look of, you know, he's interested in her, and she's looking back at him without blinking or without looking away, with a smile, and you already know at this point she's engaged or has a fiance.
Yes, enter Hugh along with Mr. Levitt, who comes to London to visit her. You know, presumably before he goes off for 2 years to the plantation to work. So he comes to visit her and brings Mr. Levitt in tow.
And it's another subversion of our expectations, right? Because we get Hugh, who is your handsome, you know, typical like Hollywood kind of fella, and you would think this is going to be our main character for the movie, and he's quickly replaced with Levitt, who is this kind of not as handsome. He's got that mustache. He's a little skeezy looking. And, you know, his first line of dialogue in the movie is basically propositioning Patsy for sex, you know, being like, it's lonely out there on those fields, you know, lady, like.
We should get to, but also remember, so this is also a key part where Cuddles and his,
yes,
the beloved Cuddles and his, you know, supernatural ability to ascertain character. Hugh comes to the lodge where Jill and Patsy are, and he's waiting, I guess, but he starts playing with Cuddles. And Cuddles just loves him. Cuddles just loves him some Hugh. And they're playing on the floor, and he's down on the floor. You know, they're fighting over something and play fighting. And that's when Patsy comes out the door and trips over him in this adorable way. And they're lying on the floor, and they're ha ha ha. And you see that, you know, it's just been set up for kind of like, you know, that there's like attraction there. And they're kind of setting up the scene for, you know, maybe a future romance between.
It's your prototypical rom-com, romantic comedy. It's just, you know, oh, it's she should probably be with him. You're already starting to think, you know, maybe shouldn't be with Jill, because we're getting bad cues on Jill already, and maybe Patsy should be with him. And yeah, wow, how different this movie goes.
Yeah.
From here.
Yeah. So we have the scene laid out where we have these kind of romantic entanglements starting to happen, and we see Jill definitely kind of moving up, you know, in the, you know, theater world. Hugh is obviously starting to seem like he's on the outs. Like she's not really obviously thinking about Hugh anymore, and she's got all these men courting her, and one of them is a prince, Prince Ivan. But she's not necessarily all that into Prince Ivan either. There's a very amusing scene where they go back, I guess, to her you know, I don't know, her boudoir, or maybe Prince Ivan's, you know, place or whatever. It's obviously a beautiful, you know, well-appointed place. And he's standing behind her, kind of leering, kind of lurking behind her, and he kind of puts his hands creepily on her shoulder. And she has a cigarette and a cigarette holder, and she puts it in her mouth, and she just tilts her head back to kind of block his, you know, block his mouth from going in. And that was actually a kind of a funny scene. She's like, yeah, not interested.
Yeah, it was a little slapstick with that, but she's definitely you know, enjoying
toying with him,
having a prince on a leash.
Yeah.
And I think it was interesting. Prince Ivan is the sort of stand in for continental royal corruption is the wrong word, but
aristocracy, which is on the wane. This is after World War II. There's not much.
no, it's interwar. This is
after World War One.
After World War I, before World War II. So after the Russian Revolution.
Well, Patsy calls him a phony prince at one point later in the movie too. So I don't know, maybe he's just taking on the title.
I know I've read a little bit about this. I'm no expert, but I know that like after the war, there were a lot of pretend Russian aristocrats sort of swarming all over Europe. Like the whole like Alma Romanov thing.
Okay.
That Matthew Weiner, is that his name? The Mad Men guy.
Oh yeah, the Romanovs
did that limited series. But it was based on like a real thing that really happened, which is people lying and pretending to be Russian aristocrats. Anyhow, yeah, I think what he stands for is more interesting than like the particularities, which is like continental Europe and royalty and
stiff
having a royal personage in her grasp is significant for the story. I feel like Jill's path here, the parallel between Hugh and Levitt in the on the plantation and Jill with the pleasure garden, which is a garden, and the royals and the various flies in her spider web. It's a maybe it's not the strongest parallel, but there's definitely something in my mind to that. And I can't really say what it is, so I'm totally useless right now.
I think I around this point in the movie, I kind of came up with my theorem on this movie, which is that the pleasure garden is one of a number of things. It's either love, sex, money, or fame, because those are the four things that almost every character in the movie is lusting after, is like trying to get. And they're pretty straightforward about it, from Levitt, sex, Hugh, love. Patsy's the only one who's kind of on the fence. And until I think she sees, there's actually Levitt asks her straight up, do you believe in love, when she's looking at Hugh with Jill when they first meet. And she doesn't really answer. And I think that's where it puts the idea in her head that that's what she's going to chase and starts to make her turn. But I wanted to bring up one character that I like to, when we watch these movies, we touch on the things that we're interested in, but there's also things that I will find questionable that I feel like should be addressed probably. And maybe I'm not the person to address it, but since it's the three of us, I feel like I should try. And I did a little bit of quick research on this, so bear with me for 1 second. So I want to talk about the Hitchcock trope that does not get as much attention as blondes and staircases, but apparently it is a trope. And it occurs when Hugh asks about Jill. We cut to Jill at Mr. Hamilton's apartment, which already suggests something illicit because she's supposed to be trying on the costume. And so the idea for getting undressed at her boss's apartment is in our head. We go to a shot of her in full, wearing the costume, posing. And then we pull back and we see Mr. Hamilton's lavish apartment. And in the foreground, not looking at Jill, is Mr. Hamilton smoking a cigar, I believe, on the couch. And next to him is a character who's not listed in the cast list, who is a male character who is sitting on the couch with his legs tucked under him, his arm around Mr. Hamilton, and he has long shoulder length hair.
Oh yeah, the costume designer. Yeah.
Costume designer.
So yeah, quite obviously, quite stereotypically gay.
Right.
Yeah.
So that kind of led me down a little quick rabbit hole and starting with Wikipedia, where I looked up something called queer or gay coding. And this is what I got from Wikipedia really quick. Queer or gay coding is the subtextual coding of a character as queer. Though such a character's sexual identity may not be explicitly confirmed within the respective work, a character might be coded as queer through the use of traits and stereotypes recognizable to the audience. Such traits are varied, but traits of exaggerated masculinity, femininity, vanity, and hypersexuality are frequent. And that led me to an article called, again, because I'm not an expert in these topics, called Gay Coding in Hitchcock Films by Scott Badman and Connie Russell Hosier on the Mensa website. So these people are experts, where they point out how Hitchcock used this coding in some of his more famous movies. They don't mention The Pleasure Garden particularly, but they say this, which I thought was interesting. Hitchcock intentionally used the stereotypes and misinformation of his era when they helped him manipulate the audience's reaction, sometimes in highlighting the villainy of his villains. Society today is, in general, more accepting of LGBTQ people, making it hard to comprehend how toxic the societal attitudes were in Hitchcock's time. His gay coding undoubtedly reinforced those toxic attitudes among straight audiences sometimes. However, Hitchcock's thorough and thoughtful development of so many gay characters reveal his humanity and acceptance of homosexuality. Now, that character does come back later in the film, and I want to touch on that scene when we get to it. He has a very interesting kind of character arc that mirrors Jill's. And it just made me realize that a lot of these characters have very Shakespearean motives. They're very driven in one particular way. And kind of shifted my views of the movie a little bit where you kind of start to see Patsy is the main hero that we should be following. But the thing that's interesting is that there's all these views presented, but no characters judge the other characters until Patsy judges Levitt at the end. So you're basically shown these ways. You see Jill climbing, but no one ever says directly to Jill's face, you're doing something horrible or you're a horrible person. No one criticizes her. So it's left to the viewer, us, to make these decisions like, oh, Jill is a bad person because she didn't help her friend. Or the Sideys are good people.
Well, she dumped the nice guy Hugh, and now she's.
But from Jill's perspective, she doesn't care about love. She cares about fame and fortune. So Hugh couldn't provide that. So you can't really. We never are given an inkling that she cared about love. So maybe Hugh was his weakness was that his oblivious to what was in front of him because of his obsession with love. So there's always a weakness. So Jill's weakness would be her lack of empathy towards the people around her because she's so focused on herself. It's kind of the way I see it. Patsy being like one empty vessel kind of could go either way.
But get back to the character arc of because the gay character for me was just sort of like, I just remember it as being sort of played for laughs. I mean, I felt like that, like he has this very foppish hairstyle and wardrobe and and very exaggerated gestures. But what do you mean by his character arc?
Well, all right. His last scene in the movie, the last time we see him is actually also the last time we see Jill in the movie, and it's after Patsy goes to ask for money to go visit Mr. Levitt, which we'll get to all that. But so she goes to ask for money, and she says, "I can't. I'm spending the money too much on my trousseau," which I had to look that word up. It means her clothing, basically.
Her wedding linens and all that kind of.
Yeah. So we see Patsy leaving, and as she's leaving, we see Jill at the table and the clothing designer smiling very widely, tapping his fingers as she counts out all this money. And you realize he's doing the same thing Jill is doing. He is using his abilities, and he's the only character in the movie who gets one over on Jill at all. And it's because Jill's strengths, her sexuality, have no power on this guy. So he is able to basically bilk her on, she clearly doesn't know what she's doling this money out for. He's got all these receipts and papers.
Well, wait, hold that back up. I mean, I'm not disputing your thesis. I think this is a really interesting point. I completely missed that he's bilking her. I mean, she's buying clothes because she wants clothes.
Yeah, I mean that
he's providing
the price is set by him the same way that she would decide at the beginning when Mr. Hamilton says, "I'll pay you whatever, $5," and she ups it to 20. Okay. He is in charge in this situation. So
is the implication that he's cheating her, or is she just getting?
Watch the scene again, and I'll put it up on the screen here. But he is smiling while she's tapping it, and he's like doing one of these things while she's taking money, and she's clearly like, "Oh, is this the?"
And he's got this kind of like, "Hey,
like the classical." Oh, yes,
Right? Yeah, there's definitely I do remember that, and I interpreted that scene. I wasn't really so much paying attention to him. It was more just how she denied her friend any assistance, where in the very next breath she's able to just shovel all this money over for her wardrobe and clothing or whatever. And that's how I interpret it. But
yeah, the import of that seemed to me more to be that Patsy, who had selflessly given to Jill earlier in the story, now there's like a reversal, and Jill is in a position to help Patsy, and she doesn't. And she doesn't because she has her own selfish desires, which supersede the honest, solid middle class couple that she's lodging with are their characters totally different. And you're right, like the background and the characters of the dressmaker are probably given their own kind of I don't want to say arc, but they're he definitely represents the negatives of the world, the glamorous theater world that is
decadence.
Yeah. So yeah, that's in contrast to the the more
loving,
honest
sort of
the landlords who are really the heroes of this story.
Right.
Which
that,
kind of it's kind of
class values. So I mean, it's these very traditional values that kind of that win the day, I guess, in a sense. Although it seems like Jill does just fine.
These people that we're calling honest middle class whatever people, it's important to keep in mind, are the landlords to Patsy. They're not like they're selfless and they care about her and they treat her like a daughter, but they're essentially landowners who are charging her rent to live in their house, which I don't know if
they will be killed in the revolution.
Well, no. Although that was definitely in the air. That was a but it's just, I don't know, maybe it's worth remarking on that's the dynamic at play.
All right, so I want to jump forward in the movie, keep this going to Levitt asks Patsy to marry him before they go on this honeymoon. And one other blink and you'll miss it scene that I picked up on that I want to bring up to you guys is in the very same scene where Levitt asks Patsy, do you believe in love? We see, again, total blink and you'll miss it, but I think it's fantastic. You see Levitt, she doesn't answer, and it just shows Levitt, and he has a flower on his lapel when he first enters, the first time we see him. And right after she doesn't say anything, he takes the flower off and puts it on the table. And you would just think, okay, whatever. But later on, knowing what happens after Patsy gives him a flower and he throws it away, you can't help but see it any other way, except some other girl not in the movie before this gave Levitt this flower. And he basically, him throwing it, tossing it, was basically him being like, I'm into Patsy now. Like, this guy is one after the other, basically just chasing the women. And his drive just to get sex leading up to this scene of the proposal for marriage from Patsy I think it's just really great how it's kind of baked in.
That's a great observation. And I think this is just bears repeating that this is a really movie is dense with information and there's not really a moment wasted. Everything you see on screen is in service to the story in some way or another. And all these little character moments they add up to something, and they give you insight into or they kind of give you a little foreshadowing of character. Sometimes it's heavy-handed, and sometimes it's more subtle, like what you just said with the.
So an example of the heavy-handed is when they go on honeymoon, right, to Italy, and they have this idyllic honeymoon. It does appear. I mean, there are shades, and he does an interesting job, I think, of sort of conveying these moments of I guess doubt, or moments where you start to see Levitt, in a different light, where we've already had plenty of clues, right? But he's definitely more and more coming into his kind of caddish and insensitive and kind of selfish self. But the very heavy-handed is near the end, where children are coming up and talking to her and I guess asking for money. He's like, don't let those urchins get one over on you, the spoiled brats, and so he's basically saying, completely dismissive, whereas she's compassionate enough to where she's sort of talking to the local people and the local children, whereas he's just like, dismissive of them. And then the flower that he has in his lapel at this time, he removes it from the lapel and basically chucks it in the canal, right? And she's like, "You threw away the flower I gave you." And it's like, "Well, I had to, it's wilted." And that's about as obvious a metaphor as you could get. It's also, he's basically saying, the flower is off, the bloom is off the rose now. I don't really, what's communicated there is he's kind of already moved on. He's like had this, this fun honeymoon with her, and now he's ready to get back to, what we discover is his other life on
Mistress.
the plantation.
The honeymoon scene is an interesting twist for both of the characters, because on one hand, yes, you get Levitz. He's had sex with Patsy. We'd seen them in the bed on the honeymoon scene together. And then on the other hand, Patsy, and this was something else I'd missed on the first thing, is we see her praying at saying, what does she say? She says, "I ask God to grant us a happy life together." And then remembering her smirking at Jill at the beginning of the movie, praying at the bed, and how completely the two characters have now taken each other's spot, basically. You have, except Patsy, you actually believes it, right? At this point. And it's right after she tells Levitt that where he really starts to go downhill in terms of...
this is one of those things where, like, I know we're probably... I don't know what to make. It was like I think in the back of my mind, again, watching these things, I'm thinking it's crude storytelling, but maybe it's more sophisticated than I'm giving it credit for. But it definitely seems, it was like, well, first Patsy was this, and now she's not this, and I feel like a lot of backstory has just not been presented. A lot of information hasn't been presented to me. I still kind of feel that way, but
we were talking about the honeymoon and Levitt and Patsy, and Levitt's gonna go off to work, and he can't take his young bride with him, which we know is definitely not true. This is the one shot I want to remark on, because I haven't so far called out any of the interesting camera work in this movie, which there's a lot of. I mean, it's beautifully shot, and one great thing about Hitchcock from the beginning seems to be his visual imagination. But in this one shot, we see Patsy waving to see her husband off at the ship as he's going off to this unnamed colony to work on the plantation. And then in a match cut, we get the waving of another woman, not his wife, greeting him as he arrives. So he's got this
wife too.
Got this secret family, or secret wife in the unnamed colony. It could be the Middle East, it could be Africa, it could be, it's just sort of this like colony. It stands for all colonies.
It does, and like it's such a weird, and of course they're using German actors too, right? So nobody really looks, so you can't really put an ethnic necessarily. There's just sort of like this generic.
To me, it looked like it was supposed to be North African.
That's right. Morocco kind of vibe.
But it's hard to say. But anyhow, that was a beautiful shot.
Morocco wouldn't be an English colony, sorry, but yeah.
But that general area. It could be Iraq. I mean, it could be.
Right.
Could be. So anyway, he's greeted by this beautiful young woman who is his. I guess he's got. Oh God, I'm not going to say it. Never mind.
His side.
I just wrote her down as a mistress. I mean, he's married now, so technically.
I was going to say he's got hoes in different area codes, but don't cut that out. Cut that out. So this fraught relationship that he's got in the colonies is plays out kind of in a macabre fashion, and this is where the movie, as Kenny pointed out earlier, goes from feeling like a romantic comedy to feeling more like a murder mystery, or not a murder mystery, but like a tale of suspense and horror. Yeah.
It gets sinister real quick.
It gets
It
dark because well, I mean, it's obvious that when we get there, and Hugh is there too, right? So we know Hugh's there, but and first thing Hugh does when Mr. Levitt gets there is ask about Jill.
Yeah.
And Jill's like, oh well, and Mr. Levitt is like, kind of dismisses him. He's like, oh well, I'll tell you the truth, I didn't really see her that much. And the woman is there, and so he's all ready to just kind of settle into his new life, and he very quickly kind of just becomes a complete degenerate, like he's just drinking his days away. I don't know what his job was there, because it didn't seem like he was really doing anything other than just drinking and carousing with his mistress.
Classic management behavior. Yeah.
This actor, Miles Mander, he really sinks his teeth into this last part of the movie.
Yeah.
I absolutely love him here. It reminds me of like a Ray Fiennes kind of, where he's got this seedy element to him, but he's still like of a handsome guy, even though he's all strung out and in dirty clothes by the end of this. He's
all emaciated. He looks just,
he's growing a beard,
always staggering around in a way like he's unnerving. He's definitely unnerving and he seems dangerous.
If you follow the whole Pleasure Garden, kind of like my rationale from earlier, which is that you get to through love, sex, money, he's kind of this is his Pleasure Garden essentially, because he has everything. He has the alcohol, he has a woman who's waiting on him hand and foot, and everything is immediately available to him at this location that he's at now, and it's disturbing, really.
That's an interesting. It is. Yeah, it's kind of like it's no sort of pleasure garden I'd want to live in, but it seems it is kind of his. It's the pleasure garden of his making, right? I mean, he's clearly feels at home there, and even though he's falling apart, certainly mentally, he's a wreck.
Yeah, and I think maybe this might be reading too much into it, but he could symbolize the Englishman abroad. He kind of stands for like the corrupting influence of this colonial mischief that a lot of these administrators were subject to. They'd go to places like this and they'd live in these very excessive lifestyles, and exploiting the people around them. And I think there was an awareness of the corrupting influence, and I think he's more. It's more than just like I think there's a very deliberate point being made with his character.
Yeah, him showing up in the white suit on the white horse, essentially.
Absolutely, yeah. The whole sort of village kind of turning out while he shows up. Clearly a man of power and influence, and what does he do with it? Nothing good.
Yeah, it corrupts him, and he seems honestly pretty miserable. And Hugh, who's like the newcomer in this world, hasn't yet succumbed to that corrupting influence of power. But the implication is that maybe, given enough time, he could find himself in a similar state of torpor.
Right, and then meanwhile, we should probably point out too that meanwhile, Patsy is waiting for a letter.
She's been writing nonstop, just writing these.
Just waiting to get a letter from him. Finally, months or whatever have passed, and he sends her a letter and says, "Sorry, I didn't write. I'm like ill."
Yeah, he lies. So Hugh is actually sick with,
right. Malaria or whatever
he contracted, and Levitt is definitely only sick with the drink, but he's used his friend's illness as cover to lie to his wife. And when she hears this, her reaction is immediate. She's got to go be by his side.
Backfires on it. I think he thinks she won't want to come.
Yeah, he doesn't anticipate how virtuous she is, and she immediately that's when she goes to her friend Jill and tries to get money for passage so that she can go and take care of Levitt, and that's when Jill basically tells her to get stuffed, and because she's got to save for her what's that word?
Her trousseau.
Her trousseau, right?
Her expensive trousseau.
Yeah.
So Patsy ends up going to the Sides. So this is where I think it's an interesting question, like just for us as viewers, maybe it doesn't have an answer, but it's this what I call the self-sacrifice of the poor. like, are we supposed to view this as a good thing? Are we meant to understand that through the Sidys sacrificing their savings to help her, that makes them good people? They're presented as generous and as sort of like the good people, but they're also presented as clumsy, obsessed with technology to the point of, it almost looks like laziness, like where he's on the radio and he's just like a joke. And in some ways they're presented as simple. So it's almost like the simple characters will give away their things, whereas the smart characters like Jill are going to just focus and get what is due to them.
Right.
So
The common man is going to get played, right? I mean, the common men and women of the era, even though what they're doing is out of decency and self-sacrifice, and in a sense of, it doesn't even occur to them that he might be lying, or that the first thing they do is give Patsy, who's not even their daughter apparently, their what amounts to their, I guess their life savings, or certainly money they have been tucking away up, and he risks his life to climb up there, like, which really was unsettling to me. I don't know about you guys, but like watching him climb up, and she's holding him. I mean, this was in the days before, unions and OSHA, obviously, and I was like,
and it's like a china cabinet, so you picture the whole thing falling forward.
Right.
There's a slapstick quality to this scene that I think is, like you expect it to play out differently, maybe, but it's worth noting how many tonal shifts happen in this movie, because you can go from melodrama to slapstick on a dime. For romantic comedy and everything.
So let's wrap up this story.
Yeah,
let's go. Let's finish this home stretch.
So Patsy arrives. She gets the money from the Sidys. She shows up and finds Levitt in the arms of his mistress. I like how Levitt plays this scene, because he seems confused when she shows up. He's clearly trashed. His hair is all messed up. On one hand, he tries to throw the mistress out, and then immediately after that, he's pinning her against a wall, like he's going to just ravish her right there in the room. So it's almost like he's confused on what he wants. He has everything. He's got the two women here, but he knows he's in trouble. He doesn't want to be in trouble. But of course, Patsy rejects him. And it's in the one scene where I noted where someone's called out for their behavior, but she calls him a filthy animal. The German title for this movie was originally going to be it was like the Lust Garden and whatever it is in German, but they thought it was too racy. But I feel like that's a more just term for this movie, since it's people really lusting after something that's driving them all. So she finds him in there, and she leaves.
She basically leaves, right? And then and that's where we also are introduced, like, someone who it doesn't seem like his role is explicitly called out in the movie. I don't know if you guys noticed that, but when I was reading the Hitchcock book, the synopsis there is they call him a doctor, like he's a local doctor. So I guess that's why he was visiting Hugh, who we discover is there and is ill in that scene. And so what he says is, okay, well, so she goes back to the doctor, and apparently she's going to go back to the, whatever the docks to get a boat back to and sail back to England. But he's like, well, maybe you can help me, take care of his friend who's sick while you wait for the boat, to arrive, the ship to arrive, the next ship. So that's when he takes her to Hugh, who we find like under a mosquito net outside, delirious, feverish, and so they have this weird kind of reunion. I don't know if I'd call it weird, but he doesn't actually, I think he calls her Jill, like he thinks she's Jill first.
He's in such a delirium, he doesn't know who she is.
Right, yeah.
But she helps nurse him back to health, and somewhat predictably, they end up falling in love.
Yeah. And then Levitt gets jealous, and he comes over wearing this. I don't know. Did anybody else notice how weird that shirt is? It looks like he's wearing a fishnet shirt.
Yeah, it is. It's really.
I don't know what is up with that shirt, but he's wearing like this weird fishnet shirt, and he comes staggering over, and he's like, "That's my woman," and he pushes him down, and of course Hugh is too weak to fight.
Well, hold on. We missed a really important part. He kills the mistress.
Oh, that's right. So the mistress who's distraught. I'm sorry, yeah, you're right. The mistress who's distraught goes out into the ocean. And so Levitt calls after her, and she's like, oh, good. Obviously this was a stand-in because she didn't really go in the ocean, and we know why.
Because of menstruation.
But so she turns around and she's like excited that Levitt is calling to her, and so he swims out to her, but instead of them embracing, he just drowns her. And this rather macabre scene where he basically just he holds her underwater and she drowns, and then he goes and tries to take his wife back from Hugh, I guess.
In the most lamest, I do like the lame fight between the ineffectual hero who is sick with fever in the bed and the scrawny Levitt, who now he's got the fishnet shirt. He looks like he's soaked because he's been in the water. He's so skinny, like skin and bones, and he's like shaking his fists at. They go, I'm gonna bash in Hugh's head.
It's not a very well choreographed fight scene.
But yeah,
it is almost comical. Well, it's not even almost. It's definitely comical by I think today's standards. But yeah, he winds up dragging her. Well, no, he doesn't drag her back. She basically says, so she shows an interesting degree of autonomy and strength here too. Especially maybe of that era. But she basically says, I'm going to go with him. I'm going to go with Levitt, because he's crazy and he's liable to hurt us. I think that was the gist. I don't remember exactly what she said. So she, of her own volition, says, "Okay, I'm going back with you, and then I'll come back to you. Once he's kind of calmed down." So then they go back to Levitt's, filthy hovel.
Yeah.
The only other scene, I love this whole end scene a lot, but the stop and you'll miss it scene I want to point out, and this is my last one, I promise. And I could be wrong on this one, that's one thing, is right before Levitt goes to retrieve Patsy, and right after he's murdered the girl, we see Levitt back in the hut for a second, and he's sitting in his chair in a delirium, and he looks to the table to his left, and there's a bottle of whiskey or whatever the heck he's been drinking on it. And I could be wrong, but I think what's spread out on the table is a handful of wilted flowers, which again, that theme comes up of he's looking at all of his failures or the things he wanted, and now where he's at, he's a murderer. His wife is leaving him. They could be crumpled up pieces of white paper. It's hard because
clearly did not watch this movie as carefully as you.
Yeah, I know. I caught it, and I'm like, is that flowers? It was one of those aha, brilliant moments. Like, wait a minute, like that's so cool if that's what that is, because he's at this complete nadir now where he's facing all of his failures. So we get to the Patsy and Levitt in their final showdown.
And he begins to see the ghost of the native girl who he killed, and he's obviously hallucinating and freaking out. And she's tormenting him. The ghost is tormenting him. Nice kind of double exposure, primitive ghost effect, but serviceable. Must have been really cool at the time.
She's very creepy in this scene too.
She is creepy. You're right, and he's creepy. And it's definitely there's this sword on the wall that he takes down. So there's a weapon convenient to him, and he pulls it down and he starts basically. He's taking it that she won't rest. The ghost of his lover won't rest until he kills Patsy. And so he decides he's going to kill Patsy. And Patsy runs into a different room and closes the door, but the door is like this lattice work. So you can see him outside the door, and he's jabbing the sword through the lattice at her. And then he pulls the door open. And then at the last possible moment, right as she's about to be stabbed, there's a gunshot, and you see Levitt turn around and kind of stagger around, and he's just kind of confused as to what has happened. And he looks down and he's bleeding, and you see the doctor standing there with a gun in his hand. And
it's a kind of a nice over-the-shoulder shot of the doctor. Like, it feels like
I couldn't make out what Levitt said too, but it looked, whatever he says in that scene looked very casual, like sort of like, oh, like, hey, like it was very, like he wasn't screaming, he wasn't mad, like he looked like the fever had broken and he was calmed down. It was played really well.
Yeah,
yeah, bullet hole you're watching it and you think, well, oh, they're not going to show the special effects, and then it's this great shot where he just pulls the shirt over and you see the blood there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he's hats off to him. He's kind of like his character was not that interesting
No.
until this scene, and that's when he really, let it rip. He really, I guess, really seemed to relish playing that character. I can see why. He was, when you're playing a lot of buttoned up, English characters, and suddenly you can just kind of be a raging lunatic wearing a fishnet shirt. It's kind of like
His acting style felt very modern to me, sort of like, if you cast Jared Leto in that role, that's the way he would do it. He'd be drunk on set. The method acting is strong there. It was. I really liked it. So yeah, the movie ends with, I guess, basically happy ending. I think one other subversion is that when he's shot, my first thought is, oh well, Hugh has mustered the strength to come and rescue Patsy, and again, it's subverted, and it's just the random doctor you'd seen earlier stepping in.
And Hugh is still in a weakened state, still needs the sort of help with Patsy to get through. He's sort of like a sickly guy at this point.
And in another scene of ridiculous, again, I don't know where this plantation is particularly, but they're carrying him on a bed like a little sultan to see them. And then he gets up and he's fine. He's standing and he's hugging, embracing Patsy. So I guess happy ending.
Yeah, they got married. They go back to Cuddles. Cuddles is psyched to see him.
All right. The story concludes with Cuddles sort of tying all those threads together.
And Cuddles tying all the threads together and also chewing the radio headset that belonged to
the generous hero, Mr. Sidey.
Yes.
That we should all try to be more like Mr. Sidey.
We definitely should. Maybe a
Sam,
little.
I detected you didn't like the Cuddles ending.
Yeah, no, your detection is correct. Yeah,
It is pretty stupid.
It's not a perfect movie. There are a lot of great things about it, but the stuff with the dog is probably my least favorite part of it. It just feels really silly.
All right, guys, let's wrap this thing up. Let's do the MacGuffins. You guys ready?
Yeah.
Yes, let's do some MacGuffins.
Let's get some MacGuffins going. Sam.
MacGuffins up here.
Yeah, as far as rating this movie, I'd give it a solid 2. It's got a great visuals. It's interesting story in many ways. It's got some standout acting from a few actors. The guy who plays Levitt, as we mentioned, or as Kenny mentioned, was pretty particularly good at points. It's just an interesting movie to look at, and I 2 out of 5 is pretty good score for a movie from this time period. I obviously, in the context of when it was made, it was probably more dramatically rewarding to watch. I don't know if your modern expectations can be completely put aside watching a movie from the 20s, but I would say there's a lot to like about this movie. It was far from perfect, but for inventive visuals, for sort of interesting thematic elements, for occasionally good acting, I'd give it a solid 2.
Okay, my MacGuffin review is, having watched this film multiple times now, I actually like it better than the first time that I watched it. I'm looking forward to the BFI version to see what was left out. However, they said it was like a half an hour longer. So ideally, parts that connect these stories a little bit tighter. To me, the movie was about ogling things and desiring things. There's voyeurisms on display. We, the viewers, are invited in some really original ways through some fancy shots Hitchcock uses. I mentioned earlier, the original title in German was meant to be Der Garten der Lust, or I guess the Lust Garden, if that's the proper translation. But we get to see the world through all these different points of views. We get to lust at the women through the eyes of the audience on screen. We get to appreciate the climb of fame and money that Jill goes on. Patsy is the holdout. She isn't particularly lusting for anything until Hugh arrives in love with Jill, and she realizes that's what she wants. The movie's main conflict does seem to be in deciding what's the best way to live your life. In the end, it seems like Patsy's version prevails, where a man and woman fall in love and end up happily ever after. But we don't ever actually see Jill or the costume designer again after a certain point in the film. And we're not given any reason to think that they're unhappy or worse off than for their self-indulging chase of money and fame. I would imagine they're doing just fine and probably very happy. The only version of How to Live Your Life that completely falls apart is the one that only Levitt holds, which is the one of immediate gratification, which is kind of ironic because in the modern era, to me, that's the way most of us live. We have the internet. We can get everything we want immediately. We can just feed our desires very quickly. And it's, for whatever reason, anything we want at the moment's notice, we're only limited by our ability to want things. So Levitt wants alcohol, sex, and by the end, escape. He's up front in asking for these things. The first time we see him, he's asking Patsy essentially for sex. His island girlfriend knows to not, or his plantation girlfriend, she knows just to bring him those things. He only cared about what was in front of him and had no desire to chase anything else. We celebrate his death at the end of it, but I'm not sure if we should or not. If we were more like Jill or the costume designer, maybe we'd be happier and more satisfied in our lives. If we were more like Patsy and Hugh, we'd be happy, but poor, is what I kind of took away from that. So what is the real pleasure garden in the movie? That's something that, again, the first time I watched it, I didn't come away with anything super deep. And watching it multiple times, I don't know if I'm just falling down a rabbit hole of metaphors and thoughts. But anyway, I'm going to give this movie 3 out of 5 MacGuffins. I really, again, the first time I watched it, I probably would have given it 1.5 and said, I hope for the BFI version will fix it a little better. I like it a lot more now. I give it 3 out of 5. I think it's a great movie. It's short, so it's an easy entry to the silent era. And it's pretty easy to follow in a sense, story-wise. You can't really get too lost in it. And that's my review.
Okay, obviously you thought a lot more deeply about it than I did and examined it thematically to a much greater degree than I did, but and you make some very interesting points, and that actually kind of makes me like the movie better in sort of examining it from the framework of the thematic framework of the pleasure garden, what that means to the different characters. I hadn't really thought too deeply on it, to be perfectly honest, but my view on it, however, just after, this is the first silent movie I've watched in a long time. So I feel like I want to grade it on a curve, or I also feel like I'm trying to put myself in the mind of an audience member. And then on top of that, there's also this extra complication of it not necessarily being, or in fact, almost definitely not being the version that was shown originally in theaters at the time, right? So we're looking at a highly edited version. But with that said, since that's all I have to go on, I mean, I give it 2. You definitely get the sense that this is a young filmmaker and in a young medium, right? So it's still very early days. It feels a little clumsy at times. The story feels, for me, the story, although there are some interesting tangents, definitely some interesting tangents, maybe I should give it a 2.5. I'm going to do that. I'm going to up my MacGuffin from my original to 2.5, because there definitely are some interesting, threads in that story. And there's a lot of visual metaphors that are interesting. But it's also at times seems a little clumsy, and it seems a little boilerplate too at the end, where, they have this kind absurd reunion. The ending is just saccharine, sweet, where they all have this reunion back in Patsy's, apartment, and the dog is there, and is super excited to see both of them. And then the nutty dog chews through the stereo wires, and it's just all that part is just so schlocky. And I mean, again, that's like a Hollywood ending, right? In so many films, but it still is kind of feels lazy and kind of tacked on. There were, the last part of the movie was also so weirdly different from the beginning and the middle of the movie. Like you say, it almost feels like two different movies, and I don't know if that's intentional or not. It doesn't. My sense is that it wasn't, and if it was, then maybe there's something that I missed in the edits that would have clarified that or made it seem a little more obvious. But in my view, it just kind of seems a little clunky. So 2.5 stars. There's some inventive storytelling. There's some interesting shot camera work, some cool symbolism, some maybe a little more heavy-handed than I would like, but yeah, 2.5.
All right. All right, everyone. Thank you for watching this episode, our first episode. Sorry, it ran a little bit long. We're going to be apologizing probably for all of them for running a little bit long. Your assignment for episode 2, should you choose to take it, is to actually, you don't have an assignment. You can just actually wait till next week, because we are going to be reviewing Hitchcock's second movie, The Mountain Eagle, which is lost and nobody has. So take a week off. Go buy The Lodger on Criterion so that you're ready for episode 3. We'll fill you in on The Mountain Eagle next week. We will show you every frame that we can find from that movie, and we will give you our hypothesis on what we think the movie was about. And thanks for joining us. We'll see y'all next week.
The phrase I use is moronic logic.